All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. Let me just say right off the bat that this is a listener suggestion. This comes to us from Joseph, and we love listener suggestions. But as I get into this, please remember, Joseph is responsible for the words that we are all about to say and what I'm about to read, because this gets very weird very quick. So this day, June 3rd, 1993, Andre Kolingba, the president of the Central African Republic, wrote a letter formally acknowledging, quote, an ecclesiastical sovereignty by the name of the Dominion of Melchizedek. This was a big deal for the Dominion of Melchizedek. This was formal recognition by a real state, the Central African Republic, of what is safe to say their very fake micronation. It was a micronation, the Dominion of Melchizedek, and it was founded by one very ambitious and very unscrupulous American to basically, I think, commit bank fraud, and it would lead to a long and bizarre game of cat and mouse with authorities and the SEC, but also raise all sorts of questions about statehood and recognition and sovereignty and what is a religion and what are scams and yada, 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 yada. So, Nicole and Kellie, are you confused yet?
I actually have a beautiful mind style layout here that connects all the pieces. So
yes, I mean, this is, ultimately a scam, but it ties into all sorts of deeper political questions. That, of course, is Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And before we get into the details, I do want to read from there was a big article in the Washington Post in the late 90s, sort of after all this had unraveled, looking back a few years at it. And in the Post, they say, quote, getting to the truth about the Melchizedeks requires a walk down a bizarre labyrinth that includes a homebrew religion, officials' names that change with kaleidoscopic ease, and a history of more legal proceedings than Melchizedek has syllables. So it is confusing, but to continue to quote the Post and tell you why this is a fascinating story. The Post concludes by saying Melchizedek has leaders, laws, religion, a flag, a disputed homeland, and unreasonable territorial claim, the textbook definition of your basic nation state. So who's to say that it is phony? So like I said, this brings up all sorts of deep, big...
This is like when fake it till you make it goes wrong.
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly.
Way wrong.
So on that line, fake it till you make it. Who was faking it and what were they trying to make? Tell us about Mark Pedley.
This is a wild story, and I'm going to try not to go down too many rabbit holes because every single character and incident just leads you down another domino of scams. So it's just scams on scams on scams on scams. But it is founded, the Dominion of Melchizedek, or unilaterally declared in 1990 by Mark Pedley. His father, David Pedley, was possibly also involved. It's hard to say because David Pedley may have been dead. In 1987, a casket that purported to contain his remains was sent back to the United States. 2 FBI agents show up because they're interested in David Pedley because he, like his son, big scammer. And they want to fingerprint the corpse because they don't actually believe it's David Pedley inside there, and the family refuses. So maybe David Pedley's around. Just
pull out of the rabbit hole. Pull out of the rabbit hole. Focus on Mark.
Anyway, so Mark and possibly his deceased father declare the Dominion of Melchizedek to be a real nation in 1990. They declare themselves to be, I think in some cases, vice president, chief Supreme Court officer. And the basic idea is that they try to claim what they see as unclaimed land, and want to be recognized as a nation so that they can set up banking services under the rules of that nation. And that's how they begin to just create a whole cascade of scams.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are Ponzi schemes. There is identity fraud. They came up with fraudulent passports and were charging people as little as $3,500 for a passport. They had come up with these schemes like the 60-40 investment program, which was basically a Ponzi scheme that got 1,400 people to contribute about $4 million. And, of course, all this money is just lining their pockets. But they must have been quite, I think, charismatic and convincing, because they persuaded a lot of people to give them their money, to invest in them, to give sort of legitimacy and credence to what they were doing into this country. And it kind of goes on for a little bit before people start to blow the whistle.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions here, but one of them is, the fraud that they're committing. In part, it seems like they're just trying to dupe people and just do like generic, fraud, Ponzi scheme stuff. But also the establishment of the country also unlocks, and the sovereign country unlocks a whole sort of banking system that they can have access to. And so they're securing loans and setting up shell companies and so forth that are only allowed when you kind of are claiming yourself as a sovereign nation. The loophole they're exploiting is both kind of this air of sovereignty, but also there are some real sort of practical things that they can do because of this claim.
And that's also why being recognized by the Central African Republic is so important, because that's how nations gain legitimacy. They are recognized by other nations. And now they have this piece of paper that is signed by the president of the country saying, yes, we recognize you as a country. And it's also, they're constantly like picking different places that this new nation, this micronation is supposed to be, like far off islands in the Pacific, land sometimes owned by other countries. Those countries are not happy about, like a big slice of Antarctica that hadn't been claimed. They were just like, we'll take that. That's ours now.
Yeah, and so that's kind of
it's also how nations work.
Yeah, right. Well, that's where I'm sort of most fascinated by this. It's like if you bought a book that said "Establishing a Country for Dummies" or whatever, the like checklist at the top of it would kind of be the checklist that they went down. And so part of it is just like establish a name, establish a flag,
have a constitution.
Have a constitution, get another country to recognize you, but then also claim land. And so they're claiming like this little island off of Colombia that's submerged half of the year, and they're claiming that it belongs to them. There's a French island west of Nicaragua and an uninhabited Micronesian atoll, and they're claiming that. They're also issuing passports, and I will say that the passport of the Dominion of Melchizedek is still on the EU's list of what are known as, quote, fantasy passports. That is a really good rabbit hole to go down if you want to look at what fantasy passports are.
What we need is an NFT of that passport.
Exactly. For pure Ponzi scheme.
Man,
that's right.
But it really is like where, to me, this starts to get at some just sort of very basic questions about, and we've done a couple shows, I guess, about people who've just sort of proclaimed sovereignty, or there's that Republic of West Florida that we talked about but it's just sort of shocking to me that in 1990 someone was pulling this off or attempting to pull it off.
I mean, I think it's much easier to do this with the religion if you were to create a religion, but a country, a sovereignty sounds like it can't be that easy. It can't be that easy to get over in a lot of ways. I think my mind is always boggled by like, what other country, like what guy did they pay to be like, hey, we need diplomatic recognition, right? Like, how do you jump through that hurdle to get somebody to sign off? That to me is just like, what?
Yeah. Well, and the religion side of this is not inconsequential, right? I mean, it's not a coincidence that they named this after Melchizedek, who is a religious figure, is in the Bible, a fairly lesser known figure, I would say, but they're sort of smartly cloaking themselves in religion as well.
And they're modeling it after the Vatican, right? Because the Vatican gets recognized because it is this space that is the leadership of a religion. And they also think that it can provide them some protection, because any attempt to not recognize the Dominion of Melchizedek is going to lead to them accusing you of religious persecution.
Yeah. All right. Like most scams, and I guess like most scams we know about, this one starts to fall apart. And so over the course of the 90s, the SEC is onto this. I mean, these people are, the Pedleys were probably on the radar already. But, you know, by the end of the decade, it's kind of clear that, like, we've gotten them, we've sort of torn this apart a bit. But is there any particular way in which you feel like the government and the SEC starts to really kind of target Melchizedek?
Well, they start to go after them. I mean, the SEC files charges for fraud. A lot of these Ponzi schemes where you can't follow up with the money, or the money is all sort of scattered into these different varying banks. They're trying to hide money. And it becomes really clear that none of this is on the up and up, and that a lot of the stuff that they have created as shell companies or as legitimate investments are just all fraudulent. And as that starts to crumble, so does the country itself. There's a really great line by one of the U.S. officials that compare basically Melchizedek to a phony college university or to a fake doctor. But they say the ultimate scam is that this nation exists mostly in just cyberspace. There's no brick and mortar institution to this that can really be deconstructed.
Right.
That's why this is such a fascinating, like, this is a quintessential 1990s story. We're talking about the early internet. It's kind of still the Wild West of the digital world. Yeah. And so there are these scams which really proliferate in the 1990s because there are new spaces for them to proliferate. And people don't have yet, it's a question of how much they actually have it now, but a sophisticated reading of information they run into on the internet, because it's just such a new space. So it really does open the door for all kinds of scams. Some of them like the Dominion of Melchizedek, some of them like .com stocks and Theranos and the other things that would follow.
Yeah.
And, you know, again, I do think like there are all these deeper questions about sovereignty and what is a nation, and when do you sort of tip into something, and at some point, you know, and that it is a collective fiction or it is a thing that's sort of on paper as much as anything. I'm just remembering that we did that thing. We talked about John Lennon and how John Lennon tried to get out of the FBI going after him for his immigration status by claiming that he was a citizen of, what was it, Newtopia? Yeah. And they came up with a flag and a national anthem, which I think was just silence. But, you know, again, getting at some big questions, but also in that case, I would say argue a fairly noble cause. In this case, a little bit of a little light treason, as they say.
Light treason.
But I want to just end, you know, I mean, this story is amazing. So many rabbit holes. There are a couple just choice quotes that come out over the course of this that I really want to just make sure we get out there. So one was the comptroller of the currency, a special assistant for the U.S. government who was like one of the main people who went after Melchizedek, says, "They are always looking for a remote landmass that nobody will challenge their ownership of. Perhaps they will next claim ownership over the lost continent of Atlantis," which just gives you a sense of kind of how this works. And then my favorite line from all of this is going back to this moment that we are marking here, which is when the Central African Republic writes a letter recognizing Melchizedek. The Washington Post got wind of this. A couple years later, they wrote this big piece about it. And in that piece, they wrote, someone is quoted as saying, quote, "You get the feeling that the Central African Republic would recognize the state of denial if it had a letterhead."
None of this can be found on a Google map.
Exactly.
None of it.
The Catch Me If You Can vibes are incredibly strong throughout this whole thing. And so yeah. Any other thoughts?
I will say one of the other rabbit holes that I went down is that the occasion of that Washington Post article was because the Dominion of Melchizedek had threatened nuclear war against France for testing a nuclear weapon out in the Pacific, which they claimed as part of their territory. They claimed to be in an alliance with a group in Europe that they claimed had one of those old Soviet warheads that had been dispersed after the breakup of the Soviet Union. So again, very 90s story, and oh my God, that leaked letter threatening war is amazing.
Wild.
All right. Well, listeners, hopefully, the rest of your day is spent Googling around on Melchizedek and the Pedleys and all these rabbit holes. But I think we did a pretty good job laying this out. All right. I don't know if I'm convinced. I don't know if I'm going to send someone my 60-40 split or pledge allegiance or anything. But yes. All right. That brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.